Okay, so in this last lesson we'll come in and set off our final render for our animated sequence. Okay, so at this point now we are basically finished with all the work of this scene. So at this point now you have modeled out this aircraft, you've learned how to rig it, how to animate it, how to apply textures, how to apply dynamics and other particle effects, set up our lights, and now we're just ready to set off the final render. So at this point, what we need to do is go into the render settings and make a few minor adjustments, and then we'll be ready to see our final result. So let's go into our render setup, and the first thing that we need to do is define our time output. By default, we've had this set to a single frame, which is what we've been using for preview purposes. If we are ready to now render out the entire timeline, now we can set this to a range. Either we can set up a certain duration of frames, or we could set this to just render out the entire active timeline, frame 0 to frame 220. This can be really useful though if you have a range, so if you have maybe a couple of different machines rendering, or if you've already rendered up to a certain frame, let's say frame 100, then if you're ready to pick this back up the next day and continue rendering, then you can just set your start frame to start at frame 100 and end at frame 220 or whatever your last frame is, and continue rendering from that point. In my case though, I'll just go ahead and leave this set to render out the entire timeline, 0 to frame 220. Now below here we can choose our output size, so depending on the format and how you want this to be viewed, for most cases you'll probably want to set this to an HD video resolution. So if you wanted to render this out at 1080, that would be the default, but you also have a few other options to choose from. So in my case, I'll maybe go with something a little bit smaller, like a 1280 by 720. Okay, now below this, we have our render output. So by default, if we start to render this out, it's not actually going to save the frames. What we need to do is, in the render output, we need to define where these are going to be saved. So in Files, let's go to Browse, and by default, it's going to put this into the render output directory of the current project that you're working in. So in render output, that's where it's going to put this. So we could come in, and we need to define a file name. So we'll call this final render. There we are. Now, once we have this set up, what we also need to do is define the file type. So we can choose to render this out as an AVI file, or as an image sequence, or even a QuickTime movie if we choose. My recommendation would be to avoid using any kind of a movie sequence or an AVI. So I would always recommend some kind of an image sequence. And the reason for that is that if, let's say you get halfway through your render, and either your render crashes, or you lose power, or whatever the case may be, if you're rendering out just a single MOV file, if the render crashes partway through, that means the entire file is unusable. So you've completely lost all the rendering work that you've done. However, if you render out an image sequence, what's going to happen is you're going to get an individual image for every single frame in your scene. So in my case, if I hit render, I'm going to wind up with 220 individual images. Now that's actually beneficial, because what's going to happen is, let's say if this render crashes at frame 120, or if I have a power outage at frame 120, whatever the case may be, at that point I have not lost any of my work, because I still have 120 individual images that have rendered out. So I could just open up 3ds Max, tell it to start at frame 120, and continue rendering. I don't ever have to worry about losing any work. Rendering out an image sequence is a much, much safer option. And then you can always take that image sequence and either run that through something like After Effects or Autodesk Composite, and then spit that image sequence back out as an MOV file, or an AVI, or whatever the case may be. So we're going to set this to final render. I'm going to render this out as a Targa file sequence. I find that Targas are a pretty good mix between good quality images but relatively small file size. I'm going to save that. I'm going to set any options that we want to. So if we want this 16, 24, or 32-bit, I'll go ahead and just leave that at 32-bit for now. So that way, everything should render out correctly. Now what we could do is make a few final adjustments to this if we need to. So we can go into something like the renderer, If we needed to increase the quality of our shadows or anything like that, we could certainly do that at this point. If we scroll down a little bit further, we should have the option to turn on motion blur. Now, motion blur is one of those things that can definitely make things look much more realistic, but motion blur takes a very, very long time to render. So typically, as we start to see things like the aircraft lift off, as we start to see the aircraft start to pull away, we should start to see motion blur. That's a typical thing that we see every day in the real world. But 3ds Max won't render that unless we actually turn this option on. But again, while it does make your images look much better, it's going to very, very heavily increase your render time. So adding motion blur is one of those things I would always recommend doing if you have time. Now, if you want to get technical, there are other ways of adding motion blur in post with After Effects or Composite or something like that, but that's going to be a much more complicated process, so we're just going to keep it simple and turn on motion blur here inside of our renderer. Now, a couple other things that we may want to check here is maybe up here in the indirect illumination and some of these Final Gather options. One of the things that you may sometimes run into whenever using Final Gather is sometimes the lighting results can kind of pop. For lack of a better word, you can start to get sort of these little splotches in your lighting that can sort of bounce and flicker around from frame to frame. And that's a result usually of the Final Gather process, and more to the point, it usually has to do with this Final Gather point density. So if you find that you have some artifacts that are showing up, some splotches, you may need to take this Final Gather point density and start to bring that up, maybe something like 1.5. For most situations, typically I find that 2 is going to be a pretty extreme value. So I would start probably with a value of 1 and maybe start to work your way up from there. But keep in mind, as you start to increase these values, it will also increase your render time as well. So definitely be careful about how far up you start to bring this. Okay, so we have our Final Gather set up. We have in the renderer option, we have our motion blur enabled. And back in the Common tab, we have the file output set, we have our resolution set, and we have our frame range set. So at this point, all we have to do is hit render. Now at this point, you can see that 3ds Max is going to start to render this out. It's going to go through into the first frame, and once it's finished with the first frame, it'll do the second frame, and so on and so forth until we're finished. Now this is probably going to take a little while, because this is probably the most time-consuming part of your whole process, just the rendering out of all of your information. So depending on your computer speed, this could take anywhere from a couple of hours to a couple of days, just depending on how complex your scene is and how fast your computer is. So give this some time, and we'll take a look at what we have here in just a moment. Okay, and once that finishes rendering out, you can see once again here all of my individual frames, so frame 0 all the way down to frame 220. So this took several hours to render out, but now we have individual frames or individual images for every single frame. And like I said, I could open this sequence in something like After Effects or Autodesk Composite, whatever the case may be, and I can take a look at what those individual images look like whenever we play through those. So here's the final sequence. We have our motion blur applied. Everything looks really, really nice. So that is essentially what we start to get now. So nice little zoom in on the motion here. Okay, very nice. So that is our final render and all of the pieces that go into making this sequence. Everything from modeling to texturing, rigging, animation, particle dynamics, setting up our lights, setting up our final render, and then what this all looks like when the job is done. And that's now going to bring us to the conclusion of this Introduction to 3ds Max course. So over the last several lessons and the last several hours, I really hope that you've enjoyed yourself and your time here, because we really had a great time putting this together. Once you've had a chance to go through this, and if you want to learn more about 3ds Max and start to focus in a little bit more on some of its specific capabilities, at this point now you can start to branch out. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of the modeling tools in 3ds Max, we actually do have a course called Introduction to Modeling in 3ds Max. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about things like texturing and the texturing process, we have the Getting Started with UVs in 3ds Max course, as well as utilizing shading networks in 3ds Max. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the rigging and the animation process, we have a couple of courses that you can go through. Those would be Introduction to Character Rigging in 3ds Max, as well as Introduction to Animation in 3ds Max. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the lighting and rendering process, we could start by going through the Introduction to Rendering in 3ds Max course, and we also have our Introduction to Lighting in 3ds Max course. And really, these are just a handful of the very, very large amount of 3ds Max content that you can find at digitaltutors.com. So thanks again for your time, and we'll see you.